Hello dear readers, we're going to continue the Kite Runner, and this part contains a scene that I think we've all been waiting for. Chapter 21. We crossed the river and drove north through the crowded Pashtunistan square. Baba used to take me to Khaybar restaurant there for kebab. The building was still standing, but its doors were padlocked, the windows shattered, and the letters K and R missing from its name. I saw a dead body near the restaurant. There had been a hanging. A young man dangled from the end of a rope tied to a beam, his face puffy and blue. The clothes he'd worn on the last day of his life shredded, bloody. Hardly anyone seemed to notice him. We rode silently through the square and headed toward the Wazir Akbar Khan district. Everywhere I looked, a haze of dust covered the city and its sun-dried brick buildings. A few blocks north of Pashtunistan Square, Farid pointed to two men talking animatedly at a busy street corner. One of them was hobbling on one leg, his other leg amputated below the knee. He cradled an artificial leg in his arms. "You know what they're doing? Haggling over the leg." "He's selling his leg?" Farid nodded. "You can get good money for it on the black market. Feed your kids for a couple of weeks." To my surprise, most of the houses in the Wazir Akbar Khan district still had roofs and standing walls. In fact, they were in pretty good shape. Trees still peeked over the walls, and the streets weren't nearly as rubble-strewn as the ones in Kartase. Faded street signs, some twisted and bullet-pocked, still pointed the way. "This isn't so bad," I remarked. "No surprise, most of the important people live here now." "Taliban?" "Them too," Farid said. "Who else?" He drove us into a wide street with fairly clean sidewalks and walled homes on either side. "The people behind the Taliban, the real brains behind this government, if you can call it that. Arabs, Chechens, Pakistanis," Farid said. He pointed northwest. Street 15 that way is called Sarak Mehmana, the street of the guests. That's what they call them here, guests. I think someday these guests are going to pee all over the carpet. "I think that's it," I said. "Over there," I pointed to the landmark that used to serve as a guide for me when I was a kid. "If you ever get lost," Baba used to say, "remember that our street is the one with the pink house at the end of it." The pink house with the steeply pitched roof had been the neighborhood's only house of that color in the old days. It still was. Farid turned onto the street. I saw Baba's house right away. We find the little turtle behind the tangles of sweet barrier in the yard. We don't know how it got there, and we're too excited to care. We paint its shells bright red. Hassan's idea, and a good one. This way we'll never lose it in the bushes. We pretend we're a pair of daredevil explorers who've discovered a giant prehistoric monster in some distant jungle, and we've brought it back for the world to see. We set it down in the wooden wagon Ali built Hassan last winter for his birthday. Pretend it's a giant steel cage. Behold the fire-breathing monstrosity. We march on the grass and pull the wagon behind us. Around apple and cherry trees, which become skyscrapers soaring into clouds. Heads poking out of thousands of windows to watch the spectacle passing below. We walk over the little semi-lunar bridge Baba had built near a cluster of fig trees. It becomes a great suspension bridge joining cities, and the little pond below a foamy sea. Fireworks explode above the bridge's massive pylons, and armed soldiers salute us on both sides as gigantic steel cables shoot to the sky. The little turtle bouncing around in the cab. We drag the wagon around the circular red brick driveway outside the wrought iron gates, and return the salutes of the world's leaders as they stand and applaud. We are Hassan and Amir, famed adventurers and the world's greatest explorers, about to receive a Medal of Honor for our courageous feat. Gingerly, I walked up the driveway where tufts of weed now grew between the sun-faded bricks. I stood outside the gates of my father's house, feeling like a stranger. I set my hands on the rusty bars, remembering how I'd run through these same gates thousands of times as a child, for things that mattered not at all now, and yet had seemed so important then. I peered in. The driveway extension that led from the gates to the yard, where Hassan and I took turns falling the summer we learned to ride a bike, didn't look as wide or as long as I remembered it. The asphalt had split in lightning streak patterns, and more tangles of weed sprouted through the fissures. Most of the poplar trees had been chopped down, the trees Hassan and I used to climb to shine our mirrors into the neighbors' homes. The ones still standing were nearly leafless. The wall of ailing corn was still there, though I saw no corn, ailing or otherwise, along that wall now. The paint had begun to peel, and sections of it had sloughed off altogether. The lawn had turned the same brown as the haze of dust hovering over the city, dotted by bald patches of dirt where nothing grew at all. A jeep was parked in the driveway, and that looked all wrong. Baba's black Mustang belonged there. For years, the Mustang's 8 cylinders roared to life every morning, rousing me from sleep. I saw that oil had spilled under the jeep and stained the driveway like a big Rorschach ink blot. Beyond the jeep, an empty wheelbarrow lay on its side. I saw no sign of rose bushes that Baba and Ali had planted on the left side of the driveway, only dirt that spilled onto the asphalt and weeds. Farid honked twice behind me. "We should go, Agha, we'll draw attention," he called. "Just give me 1 more minute," I said. The house itself was far from the sprawling white mansion I remembered from my childhood. It looked smaller. The roof sagged and the plaster was cracked. The windows to the living room, the foyer, and the upstairs guest bathroom were broken, patched haphazardly with sheets of clear plastic or wooden boards nailed across the frames. The paint, once sparkling white, had faded to ghostly gray and eroded in parts, revealing the layered bricks beneath. The front steps had crumbled. Like so much else in Kabul, my father's house was the picture of fallen splendor. I found a window to my old bedroom, 2nd floor, 3rd window south of the main steps to the house. I stooped on tiptoes, saw nothing behind the window but shadows. 25 years earlier, I had stood behind the same window, thick rain dripping down the panes and my breath fogging up the glass. I had watched Hassan and Ali load their belongings into the trunk of my father's car. "Amir Agha," Farid called again. "I'm coming," I shot back. Insanely, I wanted to go in, wanted to walk up the front steps where Ali used to make Hassan and me take off our snow boots. I wanted to step into the foyer, smell the orange peel Ali always tossed into the stove to burn with sawdust, sit at the kitchen table, have tea with a slice of naan, listen to Hassan sing old Hazara songs. Another honk. I walked back to the Land Cruiser parked alongside the sidewalk. Farid sat smoking behind the wheel. "I have to look at one more thing," I told him. "Can you hurry?" "Give me 10 minutes." "Go then." Then, just as I was turning to go, "Just forget it all, makes it easier." "To what?" "To go on," Farid said. He flicked his cigarette out of the window. "How much more do you need to see? Let me save you the trouble. Nothing that you remember has survived. Best to forget." "I don't want to forget anymore," I said. "Give me 10 minutes." We hardly broke a sweat, Hassan and I, when we hiked up the hill just north of Baba's house. We scampered about the hilltop chasing each other, or sat on the sloped ridge where there was a good view of the airport in the distance. We'd watch airplanes take off and land, go running again. Now, by the time I reached the top of the craggy hill, each ragged breath felt like inhaling fire. Sweat trickled down my face. I stood wheezing for a while, a stitch in my side. Then I went looking for the abandoned cemetery. It didn't take me long to find it. It was still there, and so was the old pomegranate tree. I leaned against the gray stone gateway to the cemetery where Hassan had buried his mother. The old metal gates hanging off the hinges were gone, and the headstones were barely visible through the thick tangles of weeds that had claimed the plot. A pair of crows sat on the low wall that enclosed the cemetery. Hassan had said in his letter that the pomegranate tree hadn't borne fruit in years. Looking at the wilted, leafless tree, I doubted it ever would again. I stood under it, remembered all the times we'd climbed it, straddled its branches, our legs swinging, dappled sunlight flickering through the leaves and casting on our faces a mosaic of light and shadow. The tangy taste of pomegranate crept into my mouth. I hunkered down on my knees and brushed my hands against the trunk. I found what I was looking for. The carving had dulled, almost faded altogether, but it was still there. Amir and Hassan, the sultans of Kabul. I traced the curve of each letter with my fingers, picked the small bits of bark from the tiny crevasses. I sat cross-legged at the foot of the tree and looked south on the city of my childhood. In those days, treetops poked behind the walls of every house. The sky stretched wide and blue, and laundry drying on clotheslines glimmered in the sun. If you listened hard, you might even have heard the call of the fruit seller passing through Wazir Akbar Khan with his donkey. Cherries, apricots, grapes. In the early evening, you would have heard azan, the muazzin's call to prayer from the mosque in Shahrano. I heard a honk and saw Farid waving at me. It was time to go. We drove south again, back toward Pashtunistan Square. We passed several more red pickup trucks with armed, bearded young men crammed into the cabs. Farid cursed under his breath every time we passed one. I paid for a room at a small hotel near Pashtunistan Square. 3 little girls with identical black dresses and white scarves clung to the slight, bespectacled man behind the counter. He charged me $75, an unthinkable price given the rundown appearance of the place, but I didn't mind. Exploitation to finance a beach house in Hawaii was one thing. Doing it to feed your kids was another. There was no hot running water, and the cracked toilet didn't flush. Just a single steel frame bed with a worn mattress, a ragged blanket, and a wooden chair in the corner. The window overlooking the square had broken, hadn't been replaced. As I lowered my suitcase, I noticed a dried blood stain on the wall behind the bed. I gave Farid some money and he went out to get food. He returned with 4 sizzling skewers of kebab, fresh naan, and a bowl of white rice. We sat on the bed and all but devoured the food. There was one thing that hadn't changed in Kabul after all. The kebab was as succulent and delicious as I remembered. That night, I took the bed and Farid lay on the floor, wrapped himself with an extra blanket for which the hotel owner charged me an additional fee. No light came into the room except for the moonbeams streaming through the broken window. Farid said the owner had told him that Kabul had been without electricity for 2 days now and his generator needed fixing. We talked for a while. He told me about growing up in Mazar-e-Sharif in Jalalabad. He told me about the time shortly after he and his father joined the jihad and fought the Shorabi in Panjshir Valley. They were stranded without food and ate locusts to survive. He told me of the day helicopter gunfire killed his father, of the day the landmine took his 2 daughters. He asked me about America. I told him that in America you could step into a grocery store and buy any of 15 or 20 different types of cereal. The lamb was always fresh and the milk cold, the fruit plentiful and the water clear. Every home had a TV and every TV a remote, and you could get a satellite dish if you wanted, receive over 500 channels. 500? Farid exclaimed. 500. We fell silent for a while. Just when I thought he had fallen asleep, Farid chuckled. Agha, did you hear what Mullah Nasruddin did when his daughter came home and complained that her husband had beaten her? I could feel him smiling in the dark, and a smile of my own formed on my face. There wasn't an Afghan in the world who didn't know at least a few jokes about the bumbling mullah. He beat her too, then sent her back to tell her husband that Mullah was no fool. If the bastard was going to beat his daughter, then Mullah would beat his wife in return. I laughed, partly at the joke, partly at how Afghan humor never changed. Wars were waged, the internet was invented, and a robot had rolled on the surface of Mars. And in Afghanistan, we were still telling Mullah Nasruddin jokes. Did you hear about the time Mullah had placed the heavy bag on his shoulders and was riding his donkey? I said. No. Someone on the street said, why don't you put the bag on the donkey? And he said, that would be cruel. I'm heavy enough already for the poor thing. We exchanged Mullah Nasruddin jokes until we ran out of them and fell silent again. Amir Agha, Farid said, startling me from near sleep. Yes. Why are you here? Why are you really here? I told you. For the boy? For the boy. Farid shifted on the ground. It's hard to believe. Sometimes I myself can hardly believe I'm here. No, what I mean to ask is, why that boy? You come all the way from America for a Shia? That killed all the laughter in me and the sleep. I am tired, I said. Let's just get some sleep. Farid's snoring soon echoed through the empty room. I stayed awake, hands crossed on my chest, staring into the starlit night through the broken window, and thinking that maybe what people said about Afghanistan was true. Maybe it was a hopeless place. A bustling crowd was filling Ghazi Stadium when we walked through the entrance tunnels. Thousands of people milled about the tightly packed concrete terraces. Children played in the aisles and chased each other up and down the steps. The scent of garbanzo beans in a spicy sauce hung in the air, mixed with the smell of dung and sweat. Farid and I walked past the street peddlers selling cigarettes, pine nuts, and biscuits. A scrawny boy in a tweed jacket grabbed my elbow and spoke into my ear, asked me if I wanted to buy some sexy pictures. "Very sexy, Agha," he said, his alert eyes darting side to side, reminding me of a girl who, a few years earlier, had tried to sell me crack in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco. The kid peeled one side of his jacket open and gave me a fleeting glance of his sexy pictures. Postcards of Hindi movies showing doe-eyed sultry actresses, fully dressed in the arms of their leading men. "So sexy," he repeated. "Nay, thanks," I said, pushing past him. "He gets caught, they'll give him a flogging that will waken his father in the grave," Farid muttered. There was no assigned seating, of course, no one to show us politely to our section, aisle, row, and seat. There never had been, even in the old days of the monarchy. We found a decent spot to sit, just left of midfield, though it took some shoving and elbowing on Farid's part. I remembered how green the playing field grass had been in the 70s when Baba used to bring me to the soccer games here. Now the pitch was a mess. There were holes and craters everywhere, most notably a pair of deep holes in the ground behind the south end goal posts. And there was no grass at all, just dirt. When the two teams finally took the field, all wearing long pants despite the heat, and play began, it became difficult to follow the ball in the clouds of dust kicked up by the players. Young, whip-toting Talibs roamed the aisles, striking anyone who cheered too loudly. They brought them up shortly after the halftime whistle blew. A pair of dusty red pickup trucks, like the ones I'd seen around town since I'd arrived, rode into the stadium through the gates. The crowd rose to its feet. A woman dressed in a green burqa sat in the cab of one truck, a blindfolded man in the other. The trucks drove around the track slowly, as if to let the crowd get a long look. It had the desired effect. People craned their necks, pointed, stood on tiptoes. Next to me, Farid's Adam's apple bobbed up and down as he mumbled a prayer under his breath. The red trucks entered the playing field, rode toward one end in the twin cloud of dust, sunlight reflecting off their hubcaps. A third truck met them at the end of the field. This one's cap was filled with something, and I suddenly understood the purpose of those two holes behind the goalposts. They unloaded the third truck. The crowd murmured in anticipation. "Do you want to stay?" Farid said gravely. "No," I said. I had never in my life wanted to be away from a place as badly as I did now. "But we have to stay." Two Talibs with Kalashnikovs slung across their shoulders helped the blindfolded man from the first truck, and two others helped the burqa-clad woman. The woman's knees buckled under her, and she slumped to the ground. The soldiers pulled her up, and she slumped again. When they tried to lift her again, she screamed and kicked. I will never, as long as I draw breath, forget the sound of that scream. It was the cry of a wild animal trying to pry its mangled leg free from the bear trap. Two more Talibs joined in and helped force her into one of the chest-deep holes. The blindfolded man, on the other hand, quietly allowed them to lure him into the hole dug for him. Now only the accused pair's torsos protruded from the ground. A chubby, white-bearded cleric dressed in grey garment stood near the goalposts and cleared his throat into a handheld microphone. Behind him, the woman in the hole was still screaming. He recited a lengthy prayer from the Quran, his nasal voice undulating through the sudden hush of the stadium's crowd. I remembered something Baba had said to me long time ago. "Piss on the beards of all those self-righteous monkeys. They do nothing but thumb their rosaries and recite a book written in a tongue they don't even understand. God help us all if Afghanistan ever falls into their hands." When the prayer was done, the cleric cleared his throat. "Brothers and sisters," he called, speaking in Farsi, his voice booming through the stadium. "We are here today to carry out Sharia. We are here today to carry out justice. We are here today because the will of Allah and the word of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are alive and well here in Afghanistan, our beloved homeland. We listen to what God says, and we obey because we are nothing but humble, powerless creatures before God's greatness." And what does God say? I ask you, what does God say? God says that every sinner must be punished in a manner befitting his sin. Those are not my words, nor the words of my brothers. Those are the words of God. He pointed with his free hand to the sky. My head was pounding and the sun felt much too hot. Every sinner must be punished in a manner befitting his sin. The cleric repeated into the mic, lowering his voice, enunciating each word slowly, dramatically. "And what manner of punishment, brothers and sisters, befit the adulterer? How shall we punish those who dishonor the sanctity of marriage? How shall we deal with those who spit in the face of God? How shall we answer those who throw stones at the windows of God's house? We shall throw stones back." He shut off the microphone. A low-pitched murmur spread through the crowd. Next to me, Farid was shaking his head. "And they call themselves Muslims," he whispered. Then a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the pickup truck. The sight of him drew cheers from a few spectators. This time, no one was struck with a whip for cheating too loudly. The tall man's sparkling white garment glimmered in the afternoon sun. The hem of his loose shirt fluttered in the breeze. His arms spread like those of Jesus in the cross. He greeted the crowd by turning slowly in a full circle. When he faced our section, I saw he was wearing dark round sunglasses like the ones John Lennon wore. "That must be our man," Farid said. The tall Talib with the black sunglasses walked to the pile of stones they had unloaded from the third truck. He picked up a rock and showed it to the crowd. The noise fell, replaced by a buzzing sound that rippled through the stadium. I looked around me and saw everyone was tisking. The Talib, looking absurdly like a baseball pitcher on the mound, hurled the stone at a blindfolded man in the hole. It struck the side of his head. The woman screamed again. The crowd made a startled "oh" sound. I closed my eyes and covered my face with my hands. The spectators' "oh" rhymed with each flinging of the stone, and that went out for a while. When they stopped, I asked Farid if it was over. He said no. I guess the people's throats had tired. I don't know how much longer I sat with my face in my hands. I know that I reopened my eyes when I heard people around me asking, "Mort? Mort? Is he dead?" The man in the hole was now a mangled mess of blood and shredded rags. His head slumped forward, chin to chest. The Talib in the John Lennon sunglasses was looking down at another man squatting next to the hole, tossing a rock up and down in his hand. The squatting man had one end of the stethoscope to his ear and the other pressed to the chest of the man in the hole. He removed the stethoscope from his ear and shook his head no at the Talib in the sunglasses. The crowd moaned. John Lennon walked back to the mound. When it was all over, when the bloodied corpses had been unceremoniously tossed into the backs of red pickup trucks, separate ones, a few men with shovels hurriedly filled the holes. One of them made a passing attempt at covering up a large blood stains by kicking dirt over them. A few minutes later, the teams took the field. Second half was underway. Our meeting was arranged for 3 o'clock that afternoon. The swiftness with which the appointment was set surprised me. I'd expected delays, a round of questioning at least, perhaps a check of our papers. But I was reminded of how unofficial even official matters still were in Afghanistan. All Farid had to do was tell one of the whip-carrying Talibs that we had personal business to discuss with the man in white. Farid and he exchanged words. The guy with the whip then nodded and shouted something in Pashto to a young man in the field who ran to the south end goalposts where the Talib in the sunglasses was chatting with the plump cleric who'd given the sermon. The three spoke. I saw the guy in the sunglasses look up. He nodded, said something in the messenger's ear. The young man relayed the message back to us. It was said then, 3 o'clock. Chapter 22. Farid eased the Land Cruiser up the driveway of a big house in Wazir Akbar Khan. He parked in the shadows of willow trees that spilled over the walls of the compound located on Street 15, Sarak Mehmana, Street of the Guests. He killed the engine and we sat for a minute, listening to the tink-tink of the engine cooling off. Neither of us saying anything. Farid shifted on his seat and toyed with the keys, still hanging from the ignition switch. I could tell he was readying himself to tell me something. I guess I'll wait in the car for you, he said finally, his tone a little apologetic. He wouldn't look at me. This is your business now. I patted his arm. You've done so much more than I've paid you for. I don't expect you to go with me. But I wished I didn't have to go in alone. Despite what I had learned about Baba, I wished he were standing alongside me now. Baba would have busted through the front doors and demanded to be taken to the man in charge, piss on the beard of anyone who stood in his way. But Baba was long dead, buried in the Afghan section of a little cemetery in Hayward. Last month, Soraya and I had placed a bouquet of daisies and freesias beside his headstone. I was on my own. I stepped out of the car and walked to the tall wooden front gates of the house. I rang the bell, but no buzz came, still no electricity, and I had to pound on the door. A moment later, I heard terse voices from the other side, and a pair of men toting Kalashnikovs answered the door. I glanced at Farid sitting in the car and mouthed, "I'll be back." Not so sure at all I would be. The armed man frisked me head to toe, patted my legs, felt my crotch. One of them said something in Pashto and they both chuckled. We stepped through the front gates. The two guards escorted me across a well-manicured lawn, past a row of geraniums and stubby bushes lined along the wall. An old hand-pump water well stood at the far end of the yard. I remembered how Kaka Humayun's house in Jalalabad had a water well like that. The twins Fazila and Karima and I used to drop pebbles in it, listen for the plink. We climbed a few steps and entered a large, sparsely decorated house. We crossed the foyer. A large Afghan flag draped one of the walls, and the men took me upstairs to a room with twin mint green sofas and a big screen TV in the far corner. A prayer rug showing a slightly oblong Mecca was nailed to one of the walls. The older of the two men motioned toward the sofa with the barrel of his weapon. I sat down. They left the room. I crossed my legs, uncrossed them, sat with my sweaty hands on my knees. Did that make me look nervous? I clasped them together, decided that was worse, and just crossed my arms on my chest. Blood thudded in my temples. I felt utterly alone. Thoughts were flying around in my head, but I didn't want to think at all, because a sober part of me knew that what I had managed to get myself into was insanity. I was thousands of miles from my wife. Sitting in a room felt like a holding cell, waiting for a man I had seen murder 2 people the same day. It was insanity. Worse yet, it was irresponsible. There was a very realistic chance that I was going to render Soraya a biwa, a widow at the age of 36. "This isn't you, Amir," part of me said. "You're gutless. It's how you were made. And that's not such a bad thing, because your saving grace is that you've never lied to yourself about it. Not about that. Nothing wrong with cowardice as long as it comes with prudence. But when a coward stops remembering who he is, God help him." There was a coffee table by the sofa. The base was X-shaped, walnut-sized brass balls studding the ring where the metallic legs crossed. I've seen a table like that before. Where? And then it came to me. At a crowded tea shop in Peshawar that night I'd gone for a walk. On the table sat a bowl of red grapes. I plucked one and tossed it in my mouth. I had to preoccupy myself with something, anything, to silence the voice in my head. The grape was sweet. I popped another one in, unaware that it would be the last bit of solid food I would eat for a long time. The door opened and 2 armed men returned. Between them, the tall Talib in white, still wearing his dark John Lennon glasses, looking like some broad-shouldered New Age mystic guru. He took a seat across from me and lowered his hands on the armrests. For a long time, he said nothing, just sat there watching me, one hand drumming the upholstery, the other twirling turquoise blue prayer beads. He wore a black vest over the white shirt now, and a gold watch. I saw a splotch of dried blood on his left sleeve. I found it morbidly fascinating that he hadn't changed clothes after the executions earlier that day. Periodically, his free hand floated up, and his thick fingers batted at something in the air. They made slow stroking motions, up and down, side to side, as if he were caressing an invisible pet. One of his sleeves retracted, and I saw marks on his forearm. I'd seen those same tracks on homeless people living in grimy alleys in San Francisco. His skin was much paler than the other two men's, almost sallow, and a crop of tiny sweat beads gleamed on his forehead just below the edge of his black turban. His beard, chest length like the others, was brighter in color too. "Salam alaikum," he said. "Salam. You can do away with that now, you know," he said. He turned his palm to one of the armed men and motioned. "Rip." Suddenly, my cheeks were stinging, and the guard was tossing my beard up and down in his hand, giggling. The Talib grinned. "One of the better ones I've seen in a while, but it really is so much better this way, I think, don't you?" He twirled his fingers, snapped them, fist opening and closing. "So, inshallah, you enjoyed the show today." "Was that what it was?" I said, rubbing my cheeks, hoping my voice didn't betray the explosion of terror I felt inside. "Public justice is the greatest kind of show, my brother. Drama, suspense, and, best of all, education en masse." He snapped his fingers. The younger of the two guards lit him a cigarette. The Talib laughed, mumbled to himself. His hands were shaking, and he almost dropped the cigarette. "But you want a real show? You should have been with me in Mazar. August 1998, that was." "I'm sorry?" "We left them out for dogs, you know." I saw what he was getting at. He stood up, paced around the sofa once, twice, sat down again. He spoke rapidly. "Door to door we went, calling for the men and the boys. We'd shoot them right there in front of their families. Let them see, let them remember who they were, where they belonged." He was almost panting now. "Sometimes we broke down their doors and went inside their homes, and I'd sweep the barrel of my machine gun around the room and fire until the smoke blinded me." He leaned toward me like a man about to share a secret. "You don't know the meaning of word liberating until you've done that. Stood in a room full of targets, let the bullets fly, free of guilt and remorse, knowing you're virtuous, good and decent, knowing you're doing God's work. It's breathtaking." He kissed the prayer beads, tilted his head. "You remember that, Javid?" "Yes, Agha Sahib," the younger of the guards replied. "How could I forget? I had read the Hazara massacre in Mazar-e-Sharif in the papers. It had happened just after the Taliban took over Mazar, one of the last cities to fall. I remembered Soraya handing me the article over breakfast, her face bloodless. "Door to door, we only rested for food and prayer," the Talib said. He said it fondly, like a man telling of a great party he'd attended. "We left the bodies in the streets, and if their families tried to sneak out to drag them back into their homes, we'd shoot them too. We left them in the streets for days. We left them for the dogs. Dog meat for dogs." He crushed his cigarette, rubbed his eyes with tremulous hands. "You come from America?" "Yes." "How's that whore these days?" I had a sudden urge to urinate. I prayed it would pass. "I'm looking for a boy." "Isn't everyone?" he said. The men with the Kalashnikovs laughed. Their teeth were stained green with Naswar. "I understand he's here with you," I said. "His name is Sohrab." "I'll ask you something. What are you doing with that whore? Why aren't you here with your Muslim brothers serving your country?" "I've been away a long time," was all I could think of saying. My head felt so hot. I pressed my knees together, held my bladder. The Talib turned to the two men standing by the door. "That's an answer?" he asked them. "Nay, Agha Sahib," they said in unison, smiling. He turned his eyes to me, shrugged. "Not an answer, they say." He took a drag of his cigarette. "There are those in my circle who believe that abandoning Watan when it needs you the most is the same as treason. I could have you arrested for treason, have you shot for it even. Does that frighten you? I'm only here for the boy. Does that frighten you? Yes, it should, he said. He leaned back in the sofa, crushed the cigarette. I thought about Soraya, it calmed me. I thought of her sickle-shaped birthmark, the elegant curve of her neck, her luminous eyes. I thought of our wedding night, gazing at each other's reflection in the mirror under the green veil, and how her cheeks blushed when I whispered that I loved her. I remembered the two of us dancing to an old Afghan song, round and round, everyone watching and clapping, the world a blur of flowers, dresses, tuxedos, and smiling faces. The Talib was saying something. Pardon? I said, would you like to see him? Would you like to see my boy? His upper lip curled up in a sneer when he said those last two words. Yes. The guard left the room. I heard the creak of the door swinging open, heard the guard say something in Pashto in a hard voice, then footfalls and the jingle of bells with each step. It reminded me of the monkey man Hassan and I used to chase down the Shahr-e-No. We used to pay him a rupiah of our allowance for a dance. The bell around his monkey's neck had made the same jingling sound. Then the door opened and the guard walked in. He carried a stereo, a boombox, on his shoulder. Behind him, a boy dressed in a loose, sapphire blue pirhantoman followed. The resemblance was breathtaking, disorienting. Rahim Khan's Polaroid hadn't done justice to it. The boy had his father's round moon face, his pointy stub of a chin, his twisted seashell ears, and the same slight frame. It was the Chinese doll face of my childhood. The face peering above fanned-out playing cards all those winter days. The face behind the mosquito net when we slept on the roof of my father's house in the summer. His head was shaved, his eyes darkened with mascara, and his cheeks glowed with an unnatural red. When he stopped in the middle of the room, the bells strapped around his anklets stopped jingling. His eyes fell on me, lingered. Then he looked away, looked down at his naked feet. One of the guards pressed a button and Pashto music filled the room. Tabla, harmonium, the whine of a Dilruba. I guess music wasn't sinful as long as it played to Taliban ears. The three men began to clap. Bah bah, mashallah, they cheered. Sohrab raised his arms and turned slowly. He stood on tiptoes, spun gracefully, dipped to his knees, straightened and spun again. His little hands swaveled at the wrists. His fingers snapped, and his head swung side to side like a pendulum. His feet pounded the floor, the bells jingling in perfect harmony with the beat of the tabla. He kept his eyes closed. Mashallah, they cheered. Shahbaz, bravo! The two guards whistled and laughed. The Talib in white was tilting his head back and forth with the music, his mouth half open in a leer. Sohrab danced in a circle, eyes closed, danced until music stopped. The bells jingled one final time when he stomped his foot with the song's last note. He froze in mid-spin. Bia, Bia, my boy, the Talib said, calling Sohrab to him. Sohrab went to him, head down, stood between his thighs. The Talib wrapped his arms around the boy. How talented he is, nay, my Hazara boy, he said. His hands slid down the child's back, then up, felt under his armpits. One of the guards elbowed the other and snickered. The Talib told them to leave us alone. Yes, Agha Sahib, they said as they exited. The Talib spun the boy around so he faced me. He locked his arms around Sohrab's belly, rested his chin on the boy's shoulder. Sohrab looked down at his feet, but kept stealing shy, furtive glances at me. The man's hand slid up and down the boy's belly, up and down, slowly, gently. I've been wondering, the Talib said, his bloodshot eyes peering at me over Sohrab's shoulder. Whatever happened to old Babalu anyway? The question hit me like a hammer between the eyes. I felt the color drain from my face. My legs went cold, numb. He laughed. What did you think? That you'd put on a fake beard and I wouldn't recognize you? Here's something I'll bet you never knew about me. I never forget a face, not ever. He brushed his lips against Sohrab's ear, kept his eyes on me. I heard your father died. I always did want to take him on, Looks like I'll have to settle for his weakling of a son." Then he took off his sunglasses and locked his bloodshot blue eyes on mine. I tried to take a breath and couldn't. I tried to blink and couldn't. The moment felt surreal. No, not surreal, absurd. It had knocked the breath out of me, brought the world around me to a standstill. My face was burning. What was the old saying about the bad penny? My past was like that, always turning up. His name rose from the deep and I didn't want to say it, as if uttering it might conjure him. But he was already here, in flesh, sitting less than 10 feet from me. After all these years, his name escaped my lips. "Asif, Amir Jan, what are you doing here?" I said, knowing how utterly foolish the question sounded, yet unable to think of anything else to say. "Me?" Asif arched an eyebrow. "I'm in my element. The question is, what are you doing here?" "I already told you," I said. My voice was trembling. I wished it wouldn't do that, wished my flesh wasn't shrinking against my bones. "The boy?" "Yes." "Why?" "I'll pay you for him," I said. "I can have money wired." "Money?" Asif said. He tittered. "Have you ever heard of Rockingham? Western Australia, a slice of heaven. You should see it. Miles and miles of beach, green water, blue skies. My parents lived there in a beachfront villa. There's a golf course behind the villa and a little lake. Father plays golf every day. Mother, she prefers tennis. Father says she has a wicked backhand. They own an Afghan restaurant and 2 jewelry stores. Both businesses are doing spectacularly." He plucked a red grape, put it lovingly in Sohrab's mouth. "So if I need money, I'll have them wire it to me." He kissed the side of Sohrab's neck. The boy flinched a little, closed his eyes again. "Besides, I didn't fight the Shorabi for money, didn't join the Taliban for money either. Do you want to know why I joined them?" My lips had gone dry. I licked them and found my tongue had dried too. "Are you thirsty?" Asif said, smirking. "No, I think you're thirsty." "I'm fine," I said. The truth was, the room felt too hot suddenly. Sweat was bursting from my pores, prickling my skin. And was this really happening? Was I really sitting across from Asif? "As you wish," he said. "Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, how I joined the Taliban. Well, as you may remember, I wasn't much of a religious type. But one day I had an epiphany. I had it in jail. Do you want to hear?" I said nothing. "Good, I'll tell you," he said. "I spent some time in jail at Polecharkhi, just after Babrak Karmal took over in 1980. I ended up there one night when a group of Parchami soldiers marched into our house and ordered my father and me at gunpoint to follow them. The bastards didn't give a reason, and they wouldn't answer my mother's questions. Not that it was a mystery. Everyone knew the communists had no class. They came from poor families with no name. The same dogs who weren't fit to lick my shoes before the Shorabi came were now ordering me at gunpoint. Parchami flag on their lapels, making their little point about the fall of the bourgeoisie and acting like they were the ones with class. It was happening all over. Round up the rich, throw them in jail, make an example for the comrades. Anyway, we were crammed in groups of 6 in these tiny cells, each size of a refrigerator. Every night the commandant, a half Hazara, half Uzbek thing who smelled like a rotting donkey, would have one of the prisoners dragged out of the cell and he'd beat him until sweat poured from his fat face. Then he'd light a cigarette, crack his joints and leave. The next night he'd pick someone else. One night he picked me. It couldn't have come to a worse time. I'd been peeing blood for 3 days, kidney stones. And if you've never had one, believe me when I say it's the worst imaginable pain. My mother used to get them too, and I remember she told me once she'd rather give birth than pass a kidney stone. Anyway, what could I do? They dragged me out and he started kicking me. He had knee-high boots with the steel toes that he wore every night for his little kicking game, and he used them on me. I was screaming and he kept kicking me, and then suddenly he kicked me on the left kidney and the stone passed. Just like that. Oh, the relief, Asif laughed. And I yelled, Allahu Akbar! And he kicked me even harder and I started laughing. He got mad and hit me harder. And the harder he kicked me, the harder I laughed. They threw me back in the cell laughing. I kept laughing and laughing because suddenly I knew that had been a message from God. He was on my side. He wanted me to live for a reason. You know, I ran into that commandant on the battlefield a few years later. Funny how God works. I found him in a trench just outside Maymana, bleeding from a piece of shrapnel in his chest. He was still wearing those same boots. I asked him if he remembered me. He said no. I told him the same thing I just told you, that I never forget a face. Then I shot him in the balls. I've been on a mission since. What mission is that? I heard myself say. Stoning adulterers? Raping children? Flogging women for wearing high heels? Massacring Hazaras? All in the name of Islam? The words spilled suddenly and unexpectedly, came out before I could yank the leash. I wished I could take them back, swallow them, but they were out. I had crossed the line, and whatever little hope I had of getting out alive had vanished with those words. A look of surprise passed across Asef's face, briefly, and disappeared. I see this may turn out to be enjoyable after all, he said, snickered. But there are things traitors like you don't understand. Like what? Asef's brow twitched. Like pride in your people, your customs, your language. Afghanistan is like a beautiful mansion littered with garbage, and someone has to take out the garbage. That's what you were doing in Mazar? Going door to door, taking out the garbage? Precisely. In the West, they have an expression for that, I said. They call it ethnic cleansing. Do they? Asef's face brightened. Ethnic cleansing. I like it. I like the sound of it. All I want is the boy. Ethnic cleansing, Asef murmured, tasting the words. I want the boy, I said again. Sohrab's eyes flicked to me. They were slaughter sheep's eyes. They even had the mascara. I remembered how on the day of Eid of Qurban, the mullah in our backyard used to apply mascara to the eyes of the sheep and feed it a cube of sugar before slicing its throat. I thought I saw pleading in Sohrab's eyes. Tell me why, Asef said. He pinched Sohrab's earlobe between his teeth. Let go. Sweat beads rolled down his brow. That's my business. What do you want to do with him? He said. Then a coy smile. Or to him. That's disgusting, I said. How would you know? Have you tried it? I want to take him to a better place. Tell me why. That's my business, I said. I didn't know what had emboldened me to be so curt. Maybe the fact that I thought I was going to die anyway. I wonder, Asef said. I wonder why you've come all this way, Amir. Come all this way for a Hazara. Why are you here? Why are you really here? I have my reasons, I said. Very well then, Asef said, sneering. He shoved Sohrab in the back, pushed him right into the table. Sohrab's hips struck the table, knocking it upside down and spilling the grapes. He fell on them face first and stained his shirt purple with grape juice. The table's legs, crossing through the ring of brass balls, were now pointing to the ceiling. Take him then, Asef said. I helped Sohrab to his feet, swatted the bits of crushed grapes that had stuck to his pants like barnacles to a pier. Go, take him, Asef said, pointing to the door. I took Sohrab's hand. It was small, the skin dry and calloused. His fingers moved, laced themselves with mine. I saw Sohrab in that Polaroid again, the way his arm was wrapped around Hassan's leg, his head resting against his father's hip. They'd both been smiling. The bells jingled as we crossed the room. We made it as far as the door. Of course, Asef said behind us. I didn't say you could take him for free. I turned. What do you want? You have to earn him. What do you want? We have some unfinished business, you and I, Asef said. You remember, don't you? He needn't have worried. I would never forget the day after Dawood Khan overthrew the king. My entire adult life, whenever I heard Dawood Khan's name, what I saw was Hassan with his slingshot pointed at Asef's face. Hassan saying that they'd have to start calling him One-Eyed Asef instead of Asef Gushkhor. I remember how envious I'd been of Hassan's bravery. Asif had backed down, promised that in the end he'd get us both. He'd kept that promise with Hassan. Now it was my turn. "All right," I said, not knowing what else there was to say. I wasn't about to beg. That would have only sweetened the moment for him. Asif called the guards back into the room. "I want you to listen to me," he said to them. "In a moment, I'm going to close the door. Then he and I are going to finish an old bit of business. No matter what you hear, don't come in. Do you hear me? Don't come in." The guards nodded, looked from Asif to me. "Yes, Agha Sahib." "When it's all done, only one of us will walk out of this room alive," Asif said. "If it's him, then he's earned his freedom and you let him pass. Do you understand?" The older guard shifted on his feet. "But Agha Sahib, if it's him, you let him pass," Asif screamed. The two men flinched but nodded again. They turned to go. One of them reached for Sohrab. "Let him stay." "Let him stay," Asif said. He grinned. "Let him watch. Lessons are good things for boys." The guards left. Asif put down his prayer beads, reached in the breast pocket of his black vest. What he fished out of that pocket didn't surprise me one bit. Stainless steel brass knuckles. He has gel in his hair and a Clark Gable mustache above his thick lips. The gel has soaked through the green paper surgical cap, made a dark stain in the shape of Africa. I remember that about him, that and the gold Allah chain around his dark neck. He's peering down at me, speaking rapidly to a language I don't understand. Urdu, I think. My eyes keep going to his Adam's apple, bobbing up and down, and I want to ask him how old he is anyway. He looks far too young, like an actor from some foreign soap opera, but all I can mutter is, "I think I gave him a good fight. I think I gave him a good fight." I don't know if I gave Asif a good fight. I don't think I did. How could I have? That was the first time I'd fought anyone. I had never so much as thrown a punch in my entire life. My memory of the fight with Asif is amazingly vivid in stretches. I remember Asif turning on the music before slipping on his brass knuckles. The prayer rug, the one with the oblong woven Mecca, came loose from the wall at one point and landed on my head. The dust from it made me sneeze. I remember Asif shoving grapes in my face. His snarl all spit, shining teeth, his bloodshot eyes rolling. His turban fell at some point, let loose curls of shoulder-length blonde hair. And the end, of course, that I will see with perfect clarity. I always will. Mostly I remember this, his brass knuckles flashing in the afternoon light. How cold they felt with the first few blows, and how quickly they warmed with my blood. Getting thrown against the wall, a nail where a framed picture may have hung once, jabbing at my back. Sohrab screaming, tabla, harmonium, a dilruba. Getting hurled against the wall, the knuckles shattering my jaw, choking on my own teeth, swallowing them, thinking about all the countless hours I've spent flossing and brushing. Getting hurled against the wall, lying on the floor, blood from my split upper lip staining the mauve carpet. Pain ripping through my belly, and wondering when I'd be able to breathe again. The sound of my ribs snapping like the tree branches Hassan and I used to break to sword fight like Sinbad in those old movies. Sohrab screaming, the side of my face slamming against the corner of the television stand. That snapping sound again, this time just under my left eye. Music, Sohrab screaming, fingers grasping my hair, pulling my head back. The twinkle of stainless steel. Here they come. The snapping sound yet again. Now my nose, biting down in pain, noticing how my teeth didn't align like they used to. Getting kicked, Sohrab screaming. I don't know at what point I started laughing, but I did. It hurt to laugh, hurt my jaw, my ribs, my throat, but I was laughing and laughing. And the harder I laughed, the harder he kicked me, punched me, scratched me. "What's so funny?" Asif kept roaring with each blow. His spittle landed in my eye. Sohrab screamed. "What's so funny?" Asif bellowed. Another rib snapped, this time left lower. What was so funny was that for the first time since the winter of 1975, I felt at peace. I laughed because I saw that in some hidden nook in a corner of my mind, I'd even been looking forward to this. I remembered the day on the hill I had pelted Hassan with pomegranates and tried to provoke him. He just stood there, doing nothing, red juice soaking through his shirt like blood. Then he'd taken the pomegranate from my hand, crushed it against his forehead. "Are you satisfied now?" he'd hissed. "Do you feel better?" I hadn't been happy, and I hadn't felt better, not at all, but I did now. My body was broken, just how badly I wouldn't find out until later, but I felt healed at last. I laughed. Then the end. That I'll take to my grave. I was on the ground laughing, Asef straddling my chest, his face a mask of lunacy framed by snarls of his hair swaying inches from my face. His free hand was locked around my throat, the other, the one with the brass knuckles, cocked above his shoulder. He raised his fist higher, raised it for another blow. Then, "Pass!" a thin voice. We both looked. "Please, no more!" I remembered something the orphanage director had said when he opened the door to me and Farid. What had been his name? Zaman? "He's inseparable from that thing," he had said. "He tucks it in the waist of his pants everywhere he goes." "No more!" Twin trails of black mascara mixed with tears had rolled down his cheeks, smeared the rouge. His lower lip trembled. Mucus speeded from his nose. "Bass!" he croaked. His hand had cocked above his shoulder, holding the cup of the slingshot at the end of the plastic band, which was pulled all the way back. There was something in the cup, something shiny and yellow. I blinked the blood from my eyes and saw it was one of the brass balls from the ring in the table base. Sohrab had the slingshot pointed to Asef's face. "No more, Agha, please," he said, his voice husky and trembling. "Stop hurting him." Asef's mouth moved wordlessly. He began to say something, stopped. "What do you think you're doing?" he finally said. "Please stop," Sohrab said, fresh tears pooling in his green eyes, mixing with mascara. "Put it down, Hazara," Asef hissed. "Put it down or what I'm doing to him will be a gentle ear twist compared to what I'll do to you." The tears broke free. Sohrab shook his head. "Please, Agha," he said, "stop. Put it down. Don't hurt him anymore. Put it down. Please, put it down. Bas, put it down." Asef let go of my throat, launched at Sohrab. The slingshot made a twit sound when Sohrab released the cup. Then Asef was screaming. He put his hand where his left eye had been just a moment ago. Blood oozed between his fingers. Blood and something else, something white and gel-like. "That's called vitreous fluid," I thought with clarity. "I've heard that somewhere, vitreous fluid." Asef rolled on the carpet, rolled side to side, shrieking. His hand still cupped over the bloody socket. "Let's go," Sohrab said. He took my hand, helped me to my feet. Every inch of my battered body wailed with pain. Behind us, Asef kept shrieking. "Out! Out! Get it out!" he screamed. Teetering, I opened the door. The guards' eyes widened when they saw me, and I wondered what I looked like. My stomach hurt with each breath. One of the guards said something in Pashtun, and then they blew past us, running into the room where Asef was still screaming. "Out! Bia," Sohrab said, pulling my hand. "Let's go." I stumbled down the hallway, Sohrab's little hand in mine. I took a final look over my shoulder. The guards were huddled over Asef, doing something to his face. Then I understood. The brass ball was still stuck in his empty eye socket. The whole world rocking up and down, swooping side to side. I hobbled down the steps, leaning on Sohrab. From above, Asef's screams went on and on, the cries of a wounded animal. We made it outside, into daylight. My arm around Sohrab's shoulder, and I saw Farid running toward us. "Bismillah, Bismillah," he said, eyes bulging at the sight of me. He slung my arm around his shoulder and lifted me, carried me to the truck, running. I think I screamed. I watched the way his sandals pounded the pavement, slapped his black calloused heels. It hurt to breathe. Then I was looking up at the roof of the Land Cruiser. In the back seat, the upholstery beige and ripped, listening to the ding, 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 signaling an open door. Running footsteps around the truck, Farid and Sohrab exchanging quick words. The truck's door slammed shut and the engine roared to life. The car jerked forward and I felt a tiny hand on my forehead. I heard voices on the street, some shouting, and saw trees blurring past in the window. Sohrab was sobbing. Farid was still repeating, Bismillah, Bismillah. It was about then that I passed out. I was very much looking forward to this part of the book. I don't know, was it a bit too easy to get rid of Asif like that? Or is he gonna come after them? Make sure to like this video to encourage me on my reading journey and subscribe for the next chapter.